But moving on from Squid Games, let's talk a little bit about Star Trek. So, as you know, the trailer for season 2 of Picard kind of came out, but there was a recent interview with Patrick Stewart and the showrunner Akiva Goldsman, who wrote Batman and Robin, the movie, and is also an Oscar winner. So there's that. But there was an interview with both of them.
What a remarkable juxtaposition.
I know, right? Akiva Goldsman, don't get me started. Okay. But they basically came out and said for a fact that there are only going to be 3 seasons of Star Trek Picard.
Right.
The 3rd season is going to be the final one. There was never a plan to go past 3. They always planned for Patrick Stewart to be 3 and done. So basically a trilogy. Patrick Stewart plans to retire the character at the end of the 3rd season. So basically we're not going to see Picard again ever after the season 3 of Picard. And they started shooting it back to back with season 2. So as they started going with season 2, season 3 picked up, and they were shooting some stuff concurrently with season 2 to try to get this done. And I think a lot of that comes down to Patrick Stewart not being a spring chicken. They're like, we better get this done before he moves on to that great big stage in the sky. But are you a Star Trek fan? Do you watch Star Trek?
Yeah, sure.
What did you think of season 1 of Picard?
I was underwhelmed by it. I can't say that I enjoyed it a whole heck of a lot. I didn't hate it the way some folks did, but I definitely understand why the people who hated it did. Look, there's a lot of not complimentary things I could say about it. It's been a while. I'm trying to think back to it now. I was kind of reviewing in my head what I thought about the series when you told me we were going to talk about it tonight. Look, one of the first things that really bothered me about it is that what got me into Star Trek and the reason why I enjoyed it was my dad was a fan of the original series. And so I can very clearly remember sitting down and watching Encounter at Farpoint when it aired for the first time with my dad. And I had watched reruns of the original series with him going into it. So I kind of knew the basic idea. And I thought, okay, hey, look, this is going to be a new Enterprise and a new crew. I didn't have the same emotional attachment to people who had grown up with it. So I was very quick to adopt The Next Generation as my show and my crew. And I was young enough to not appreciate how terrible the storytelling was in the first season. So it was really, I was in the sweet spot. And for 7 seasons, my family and I got together and watched that show every week. And one of the things that I really didn't like, and my wife said the same thing because she watched The Next Generation with her dad, is that our daughter was, I think, about 6 or 7 years old when Picard came on. And it was not the kind of show we felt comfortable sitting down and watching with a little kid. It didn't feel like
it was not family friendly.
A family show. No, not at all. And look, there were other things I didn't like. First of all, like, all the self-congratulatory interviews I saw in the run-up to it about like the important, quote unquote, important trademark messaging. I'm like, guys, look, but by the time this show premiered, like doing Trump and Brexit allegories is not exactly speaking truth to power. Okay. Like I've heard this same lesson told 100 times, 50 different ways. You're not doing anything brilliant or edgy or at this point even necessary. Everyone who has an opinion about this shit already has it. And you're not doing anything to change it. And for you to come around and say doing Brexit analogies in 2019 or whatever it was is comparable to the same kind of genuinely edgy messaging that they were doing on a consistent basis in the 1960s Star Trek is just laughable. It's revisionist history. So I had a problem with that. I also had a difficult time with the fact that Star Trek has always been an aspirational franchise. It's always been a source of hope. And look, again, bleak times and a politically divisive climate in the country and the world is not something that is unique to the 2020s. Again, going back to when the franchise originated, you don't think times were tough and people were at each other's throat in this country and around the world in the 1960s. And that's what made people care about this franchise for 50 years. It was the fact that in a time of bleakness, when everybody had that same sort of dystopian lizard brain fear in them, whether it was because of racial tensions or the war in Vietnam or the fear of nuclear annihilation, that Star Trek came along and said, hey, no, this is a reason to be hopeful. And the show always cast Earth and always cast humanity as the aspirational good guys. And to me, Star Trek Picard, I think largely because of the vanity play of allowing Patrick Stewart to have, like, you know, a playground to exercise his own personal political beliefs, inadvertently was retrograde with a lot of that stuff. And so, again, I just kind of took umbrage at that as a longtime fan. And I just didn't think it was done particularly well. I thought as the season went on, it got more and more over the top. Again, going back to leave the Watchmen alone, leave a lot of these other franchises alone. I wish they would have stopped at the best of both worlds with the Borg. And I just felt, just like Boba Fett, the more and more backstory we got on the Borg, whether in the movies or Voyager or even further on in the Next Generation, the less compelling they became as villains. And so the fact that we are just going to keep flogging the corpse of the horse that is the Borg as a narrative device, they did it in this season, and apparently it's just going to keep happening again and again till the end of Picard. Like, sometimes less is more. And, you know, look, I'm letting out a lot of pent-up Star Trek Picard aggression, Matt. There are some nice things I could say about it, but I have a feeling probably your audience doesn't want to hear any of those things.
Are you kidding? I could listen to another hour of that rant. But like you, Picard was my captain. He's the guy I grew up with. Next Generation was my Star Trek show. And I was so hopeful for that series. Like, me and Matt Vader both, when we started watching it, the first episode, we were like, well, hopefully it gets better. Second episode, hopefully it gets better. We kind of likened it to being in an abusive relationship where, like, it's like, no, he loves me. You know, I just gotta hang in there. Maybe he'll change. It's like, no, he's gonna come in and slap you around.
The Federation we saw from the beginning of the original series to the end of Enterprise would not have Space Fox News doing a gotcha interview with Captain Picard, right? Like, that was an absurd, world-breaking narrative device that showed up in the first episode. And I was just like, what purpose is this serving? Like, it's not only that it doesn't make any coherent sense with the fictional world we've been allowed to inhabit for decades. Going back to my point about you're not speaking truth to power. What are you trying to tell me? That headline, a lot of people don't like Fox News. Cable news is shitty. What a daring stance to take with allegorical science fiction in 2019, guys. Man, you're just obliterating boundaries here with this daring take. It's so frustrating. And the fact that they would do it with this iconic character. Listen, you and I have talked over the years about how we're both pretty sure George Lucas didn't understand what made Star Wars good. I think along in that same vein, I have come to appreciate the fact that actors who portray iconic characters tend to lose sight, or if they ever had it to begin with, why those characters are so beloved in the first place. So it's for writers to write and actors to act, and you have to be extraordinarily careful when you allow the performer to become larger than the role or the property and give them an outsized say in what happens in the storytelling. And I got very strongly the impression that the way they enticed Patrick Stewart to come back and inhabit Captain Picard again was by allowing him free reign to influence the story. And I think he did it in ways that compromised what made the character of Picard meaningful to people who cared about him in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, Akiva Goldsman flat out said that they had to give Patrick Stewart some amount of creative control in order to get him to agree to come back.
Harrison, if you come back and do this, we'll kill off Han Solo.
Well, it's like, Harrison, please come back. He's like, can you kill off Han Solo? It's like, yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Yeah. But you know what's kind of funny is, like, as a storyteller, the smart thing to do is always is to try to make your show evergreen, try to make your movie timeless, you know,
Yeah.
because when people watch it 10, 20 years from after you make it, they're not going to know what the context was that you were trying to talk about. And I think that's one of the interesting things about all the entertainment that was made during the Trump era, where, like, you know, they're all very anti-Trump and all this stuff that they like they weave those messages into their entertainment shows. And then, like, we're going to be watching those things for 8-10 years later and just being like, oh, this is so outdated. And
again, you put an Asian guy and a Russian guy and a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise and set it in the 23rd century in 1960s television, because you couldn't tackle those topics head on in the media environment that existed with 3 television networks.
Yeah.
Right? Well, nobody needed allegory to be told that a bunch of people think Trump is bad. So, like, it's not apples to apples. It's not even close.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of the stuff that came out of the 60s and 70s, where it was all about Vietnam War allegories. You know, it's like nowadays you watch those movies and the message is just lost on you, or it's so ham-fisted that you're just like, give me a break. So I always think it's best practice for storytellers to kind of try to make their stuff timeless as opposed to timely. So that's just my thought on it. But I'm kind of glad that Picard's only going to be 3 and done, because judging on the first season and from what I've seen of the second season so far, it's not something I want to keep watching.
All right. So one final thought on that, because I'm thinking about now John Delancey's going to come back, and I love that character. I think so many people do. And I'm like, my God, are they going to ruin Q as well? Now, again, I hated all the Q appearances in the Deep Space Nine and Voyager. I think those series, I love Deep Space Nine. It's my favorite Star Trek. But in general, I think when the post-Next Generation properties tried to engage with supporting characters or races from Next Generation, with the exception of the way they built out the Klingons and Ferengi in Deep Space Nine, they didn't do them any favors. I have just, you know, look, the Disney Star Wars has taught me to put up very high castle walls in my head between the property I knew and love and the way that they're being reinterpreted in the modern media sphere. So don't let them mess with your memory of Q.
I just want to highlight this this comment from Danny the Dork Knight, one of our fill-in guys. Picard was like getting the girl you always wanted to be with when the show was announced, but by the end of it, she turned out to be the most toxic and worst thing to ever happen to you in your life. And Danny was actually on one of our Salty Nerd episodes very early on in our Salty Nerd careers, talking about Picard and the disappointment that it was. So we feel you, Danny. We definitely feel you. Like I said, abusive relationship.